Good morning, everyone. I think we can start the session now. My name is Harino, and I'm a project associate in UNU-EHS, and it's a pleasure to introduce this session with you all. And today's session is a PCCB Academy, and today have a very special topic, which is the Focus Area Day of PCCB Academy. So today we will talk about finance for action, how to bridge gaps and accelerate NAP NDC and NAP 3.0. So let me just very briefly introduce the session objectives. So first, we will identify gaps and opportunities in terms of financing and how to implement national adaptation plans and nationally determined contributions. And then we will present some innovative solutions or examples from an amazing speaker. And then we will showcase and exchange some ideas among the participants on what can be done and what is the challenges and what would be the solutions in the future. So I think most of you are aware of NDC and NAP, but we hosted a very, very knowledgeable expert to introduce you in terms of financing all of these activities and national policies. So I will invite today's speaker for setting the scene on financing NAPs and NDCs. So Justice Musa, Climate Change Specialist in Adaptation Fund.
Hello, good morning to all of you. My name is Justice Musa with the Adaptation Fund, and I'm happy to be invited to participate in this discussion. Very unique group, very small, but I'm sure the discussion is going to be very fruitful. Just a little bit of background. So I was actually trained by the PCC colleagues. I was working with the UNFCCC before moving to the Green Climate Fund, and now an Adaptation Fund. So I come with a little bit of the UNFCCC process itself, and now what kind of financial instruments that can be deployed to finance countries' ambitions through the NDCs and the NAPs. Of course, the lifeblood of climate action is finance. MOI, the means of implementation. So when the ambitions have already been expressed in our NAPs and our NDCs, the only way we will be able to realize those ambitions is to convert these national policy priorities into concrete projects and programs and get finance to implement these ambitions. So just a little bit of an advert or an introduction to the Adaptation Fund. I know all of you know the Adaptation Fund, but basically it's among the first 3 family of funds under the UNFCCC, which were established in 2001, and it was supposed to receive 2% from certified emission reduction. Kyoto Protocol didn't perform that well, so not much came through the Adaptation Fund, and donation has been received. So since 2010, we've been financing concrete projects. It's the only fund with the mandate to exclusively finance adaptation projects. And the NAPS basically expresses countries' ambition for adaptation, and NDCs also have components for adaptation. So I'll be focusing on adaptation and not the mitigation part. Since inception, we have financed projects only from grant instruments. And this is also very important when it comes to adaptation, because adaptation is a survivor issue now, and using grant instrument to finance such projects really reduces the financial burden on countries, and for that matter, they are able to really move these ambitions to real action. The good news is that over 50% of our investment are actually in LDCs and SITs, which have special circumstances and quite vulnerable to climate change impacts. The adaptation fund uses country-led process. So it is the country that has to develop the project based on their national priorities and submit the project to the fund, either through a multilateral implementing entity or through a regional implementing entity or through national accredited implementing entity. And it is the first fund to pioneer direct access, meaning we support countries' institutions to close the gaps that they have in the area of gender policy, in the area of environment, social policy, to make sure that they have the right fiduciary standard where they can start programming. And once they get accredited, they can develop projects and submit to the fund. Why is the climate funds very important when it comes to NDC and NAPS implementation? When a project is developed to the fund and the project gets approved, it performs two important roles. One, when the project is implemented, the lessons learned through the implementation helps in developing future generation of NAPS and future generation of NDCs, because some of the project's component focuses on research. So it allowed the country to identify the areas that are quite vulnerable, climate change hotspots, so that when you are designing the next NAP, you are able to include this in the next NAP that you'll be developing. Another area is that it allows us to be able to see what are the sectors that are quite important or priority, because we have already implemented some projects and we really know that these sectors, no project has been implemented, but they are quite vulnerable. The next issue is that once a project has been approved and is being implemented, it helps us to be able to collect relevant data that we need. So the adaptation fund plays a very important role in this process, both in supporting countries in the implementation of NAPS that have been developed now and also the future generation of NAPS. But as the organizer of the event said in the introduction, what are the challenges and opportunities in financing NAPS and NDCs? I would group it under the supply side and the demand side, where the supply side will basically focus on the climate funds and the demand side will focus on the countryside. And I'll start with the climate funds. Because we use country-led process, we have to wait until a country is ready to design project and submit to us. So if that is not done, there is no way the NDC and the NAPS will actually move into implementation. It will just be a document on the table. So that is the kind of limitation that exists in the system, but this is the process, and that is how the process has defined how finance should be delivered. If it was a supply-driven process, then the climate funds would deploy technical experts into the country and sit with the country to develop projects and get the project implemented. But as of now, what the process has offered is a country-led process, is a demand-driven process. The next challenge is access remains fragmented. Of course, the processes across all the climate funds are not the same, but we are working towards what we call complementarity and coherence. So there are some of the processes that we've already started harmonizing, and with time, all the processes will be the same. So the way you develop a concept, a pre-concept, and submit to the GCF, to the adaptation fund, to the SAFE, to the JEF, will look almost the same, so that it reduces the bureaucratic burden on institutions having to navigate different processes of assessing funding and different requirements in terms of reporting and implementation. Then the next challenge is direct access gap. And this is quite important to me because some of you are from countries or you've been working with the countries. Some of the climate funds have been there for over the past decade. And you already know that the precondition to access finance, one of the channel is national implementing entity. You are a country, you've already developed your NAP and your NDC, and you want to implement them, but you do not have national implementing entity, and there have not been any attempt to nominate an institution to go through the climate funds to get accredited. Of course, we all hear that it is a difficult process to get accreditation, but it is not impossible. There are institutions, there are countries that have done it. So if you are coming from a particular country or you're a partner supporting a country, the question we need to ask ourselves, why over a decade, this country that I'm supporting, as a representative of a country, why don't we have a national implementing entity? And I will cite Bhutan as an example. Bhutan, a country of 700,000 people, have a national implementing entity with the adaptation fund, has several projects under implementation across all our funding windows. They are in the process of accrediting their second national implementing entity. And I believe that if we get all the countries to get an institution accredited, even let's assume that it takes 5 years to get accredited. If a fund has been operating for 15 years and you do not have an accredited entity, if it takes 5 years, it means that you would have gotten accredited 10 years ago and you would have been programming. So even if the process is long, when are you going to start? It's something that we need to ask ourselves, and we really need to work on it. I only use 5 years as an average because there are some outliers. But there are entities that have gotten accredited in a year, right? So we can look at both poles. And the good news from the Adaptation Fund, and I think it's across all the funds, is that when you get accredited with the Adaptation Fund, you go through the fast track accreditation with the other funds. And the process is reduced. So let's assume that there are 10 areas that you'll be evaluated on. Once you get accredited with one fund, 5 is already canceled. You go through just 5. So I will employ you, if we really want to move from planning to implementation, we need to look at the precondition to be able to move from planning to implementation. And one of the precondition, country ownership, having a national implementing entity to support the already existing multilateral and regional implementing entities. Because the road to knock on UNDP, UNEP door, that we want to develop projects with you, is longer than the road to your own national implementing entity. In terms of knocking on their door and say that let's develop this project and submit the project to the climate funds. So those are the supply side. Now let's come to the demand side, which you already know. One is basically overburdened bureaucracy. I do not want to use the word or the terminology limited capacity and limited expertise. I think it is rather overburdened bureaucracy. Almost all the negotiators here have their traditional work they do. Climate change process is an added responsibility. And some of them throughout the year, they are running around in different negotiation rooms, different conferences, different events. There is no time for the same people to sit down and design projects. So bureaucracies of developing countries are overburdened. And so I do not subscribe to the limited skills. The skill sets exist, but the institution do not have enough resources in terms of the human capacity to be able to design projects. So that is one of the challenge. If we really want to support the movement of planning to implementation, the NAPs and the NDCs, then we need to look at this component as well. Then another challenge is coordination issue. Still at the country level, you go to the Ministry of Agriculture or Ministry of Water, or you go to another entity, they would ask you the whole process, how do I assess finance? But you have already spoken to another ministry, which is the DA or the NDA, and they know all the process. But the other ministries that are also important sector when it comes to climate change do not. So it appears there is a little bit of limited coherence at the country level in terms of sharing information, and I don't think it's a single day issue that you would address. It is something that we need to look at every day, so that if you are the DA or the NDA, it is important that you regularly, maybe every year or quarterly or 6 months, you have a meeting to be able to tell all the important ministries that have been captured in your NAPs and NDCs as an important agency that are supposed to move it from, plan to implementation, so that they know that these are the processes and how they will be able to access funding. We do understand that there is high attrition rate. People change very quick. So the people that you have informed within a year, they've moved to different jobs. So there should be constant communication to really keep them informed. So these are the supply and the demand side challenges. The last one will be data to inform, fundable projects. Getting 30 years data, 40 years data, 20 years data is non-existent in some countries. But the good news for the Adaptation Fund is that we support ideation. So if you have a concept, a plan, or something to do, and it is not tested anywhere, it has not been fresh, I will give you what we call the Innovation Fund. Then you implement it on a small scale, and when it becomes a workable solution, you can now expand it into a bigger project, and that is about $5 million. I believe $5 million will do something big in a community if the money is really put to the right use. So these are the challenges that I'll reflect on. I know there are many, many challenges, but I think these 6 that I've mentioned, when we really, tackle them and address them, we can really move from planning to implementation. I'll end my presentation so that you would ask more questions and I'll be able to respond. But before I end, allow me to do a little bit of advert for the Adaptation Fund. We did a recent study of 150 projects that we are implementing between 2010 and 2025, and over 85% of these projects are strongly aligned with NAPs and NDCs. So the question that I know you have in your mind is, why is the 15% not aligned? They are aligned with national priorities. But these projects, some of them were approved before a NAP was developed or an NDC was developed. So you cannot see the direct alignment, but it is still aligned to national priority. Then the next issue is also that climate change feature, one of the main features of climate change is uncertainty. So all the planning that we do now is though anchored on the current models, there is still a bit of uncertainty. So you might have a NAP or an NDC, but things are changing quickly. The time you are developing a project, you might develop a project that is not captured in the NAP or the NDC. It doesn't mean that it is not a country priority. It is because things are moving quite quick. And climate change as an uncertainty, certain things will happen and you need to quickly design a project elsewhere. In Jamaica recently with the hurricane, I'm sure there are things that they want to do now, perhaps, which might not be captured in their NDC or their NAPs, but because the event, something has evolved and they need to respond to it quite quickly. So that is why the 15%, there's no strong alignment from the NAPs and the NDC, but of course, there is still country ownership. Another thing I want to mention from that study is that because almost all the projects that comes from the Adaptation Fund is country-led, and it is often, some of them are designed with the strong involvement of the DA and the NDAs. And the DAs and the NDAs in most of the country are those that led the development of the NAPs and the NDC. So they already have that understanding. So that is why we see a very strong alignment, across board. So this is what I just wanted to discuss with you. In spite of your interest in the discussion, I'll be more happy to take as many questions than to provide you lecture and respond to those unique questions that you have, either at the country level or across board. But after Baku, when the NDC decision was made to triple the outflow of finance, using 2022 level, the Adaptation Fund hits the ground running quickly. We have increased our country cap from $20 million to $40 million. So at least every country have at least $20 million with the Adaptation Fund. So your country, though, the basket of climate finance is not full, but it is not bankrupt. So the expectation is that you develop project and submit to the Adaptation Fund using any of our funding window or using any of our routes, multilateral, regional, or national implementing entity. We would also expect that you expedite the process of nominating an institution to get accredited with the fund so that you can start programming as much as possible. We have a locally led adaptation financing window that allow you to aggregate local actors and design projects with a strong local involvement for them to be able to access finance for implementation. We notice that there are a lot of local entities doing fantastic work, but they are unable to access funding, and that is why we created the locally led adaptation funding window. That would allow us to be able to send money to these actors directly. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I look forward to continuous discussion, both here and outside this hall. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justice. I think Adaptation Fund gives a really good overview about NDC and NEF financings. I think it really gives how the countries to access to funds, especially for financing the climate policies. So I think from the next round, we will move on to some specific examples. I think Adaptation Funds already gave some examples from the funds, so we can also get to know about what other institutions are working on a regional, national, or local level. So for this round, I want to invite Mr. Walter, who is working on the Inter-American Institute of Cooperation on Agriculture. So here maybe we can look a bit about sectoral, regional, and local level. So Walter, the floor is yours.
Okay, so I don't need this. Okay. Good morning. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, sharing the experiences we are involved with in trying to access means of implementation for family farmers, for peasants, and for indigenous communities in 5 countries of South America. 5 countries that have been working together in a network of family farming of the Mercosur, which involves 6 countries: Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and what, 6? But in this project in particular, is 5 of us that are involved, five of these countries, which are Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay. The reason for this project is that family farming in the views of these countries has not received enough visibility, enough attention to its particular vulnerabilities to climate change, so it's deserve a differentiated attention. With the support by ICA in 2024, it was done a wide consultation among policymakers, rural farmers and indigenous people and peasants organizations, and also research and development institutions, in order to try to have a kind of a state of the art on what we know, on how can we enhance resilience in this particular type of agriculture. And what we have verified is that even there are many internal differences between countries due to different ecosystems, different production systems, but there are many common issues. And these common issues gave support to the idea that we could identify a regional project to go for means of implementation with the Adaptation Fund. So now I will see if I can ask to project a short presentation I brought to make it more clear. 5 minutes left. It told me it had 15 minutes. Only 5? Wow. Well, then my presentation is going to be even shorter. So the main ideas are that there is a high exposure to climate change, for example, droughts, floods, heat waves, and that this produces severe impacts to production systems that in many cases cause farmers to go out of production and move to cities to look for opportunities to get their lives. And we can have identified that the instability of production system increases due to climate change. There is more pressures of pests and diseases. There are more problems with water and with hydric stress, reduction of yields, losses and damages, and in general this affects the food security for farmers, but also for the country as a whole, because family farming produces around 80% of the food that is eaten in our countries, in these countries. So it's very significant, very relevant to pay attention to this sector for the food security and also for the livelihoods of millions of farmers and peasants and communities that are involved in agriculture. The objective of the regional projects that the countries have identified and the ICA gave support was to reduce the climate vulnerability and strengthen the resilience in these 5 countries and address common threats to promote the adoption of adaptive production technologies and practices, to improve the access to technical assistance services, to strengthen local and institutional capacities, and to integrate traditional and research knowledge into adapted solutions, to establish participatory mechanisms for territorial and scalable governance. The countries, these 5 countries, identified the Adaptation Fund as the most interesting opportunity to access finance, because the Adaptation Fund is specific for adaptation, because it has a window for regional projects, and it has procedures, and it can receive concept notes and then full proposals that can deliver now up to $30 million as a grant. Grants fund is seen very important because normally loans that increase national external debt are a problem for these countries, because you know that ministries of economy are not very much fond of increasing external debt. So when they saw that it is a grant, they say, okay, that is very good. And the project has a rather small scale. It's not national wide, but it is every country chose a regional selected to prioritize a particular region in order to learn from that, in order not to spread too much the resources, and then with lessons learned, see how to scale up the action. The project has 4 components. Component number 1 refers to regional networks, knowledge sharing, lessons learned, creation of work together to create tools, for example, tools for monitoring evaluation and learning, tools to monitor losses and damages, and exchange information, for example, on early warning systems, for example, how to create regional insurances against climate, index insurances, that are more easy to find an agency that ensures, the agency that ensures. In Spanish is reaseguradora. In English, I don't know the translation, but you always need someone that gives insurance to the insurance. So this is, if you have a regional project, it's very unlikely that you will have a severe drought in the 5 countries. So it's some way to dilute the risk. A second component is to promote implementation on the ground and the adoption of technologies by farmers, enhancing and strengthening the technical assistance services, and combining the knowledge from science with the knowledge, traditional knowledge, and also to see opportunities to identify and the collaboration between research institutions to provide more answers to problems that still don't have enough answers. The component number 3 relates to financial services. One key characteristic of this type of farmers is that they have difficulties to access finance. So the project proposes to identify solidarity based on inclusive financial services, including associated with risk transfer or payment for ecosystem services, for example. And finally, component number 4 is about MEL, which is very, very relevant. The organizational structure of the proposal, the concept note has already been presented to the Adaptation Fund, and now the countries are working with the support of IICA, CAF, and REAF to prepare the full proposal, taking into account the feedback by the Adaptation Fund. So CAF, which is the Development Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean, is the implementing agency of the proposal. IICA is the execution entity, and then REAF is a national network for coordination on agricultural farming, family farming. And of course, it's very crucial to involve the national designated authorities from the beginning, not after we have the cake, go and present and say, approve this, but they have been involved from the very beginning so that the endorsement of the proposal is ensured. Well, there are environmental risks identified. I don't know how much time I still have, but the project is very careful in paying attention to compliance with the law, to access and equality, to the involvement of marginal and vulnerable groups, to gender equality and empowerment of women, to indigenous peoples, to conservation of biodiversity, and to physical and cultural heritage. And there are proposals to mitigate any potential risk in these dimensions. Okay. For example, developing a regulatory compliance plan for each country, designing inclusive beneficiary selection mechanisms, developing participatory diagnostics to identify specific vulnerabilities, create rural women leadership schools, incorporate traditional knowledge to the adaptation plans, prioritize agroecology and ecosystem restoration technologies, and assess physical and social heritage before interventions in the territory. So we want to ensure that this is very well taken into account, and there is a huge interest in the 5 countries to consider agroecology and restoration technologies as those practices that can not only build resilience, but also contribute to the transformation of agricultural production systems to more productive, more resilient, and more adapted to climate change, while protecting biodiversity, avoiding soil erosion and degradation. Well, this is the reason we went to the Adaptation Fund, but the countries went to the Adaptation Fund, which I have already said. And the status of the progress now is that a concept note has been prepared involving the 5 countries and the authorities of the countries and the national designated authorities and the Ministers of Agriculture and REAF. We are waiting to receive the feedback from the Adaptation Fund. And meanwhile, preparation of the draft full proposal is advancing. And I have to share with you that a regional project is challenging. Imagine that to agree and coordinate 5 countries with several institutions in each country, make the consultation process, which is critical and which is relevant for the process, but also for the Adaptation Fund, to see that the proposal has been consulted in depth with the beneficiaries of the project. So particular attention was paid to the consultation process, and will continue this consultation process to move forward. And I highlight that even if these countries are different and have internal differences, they have also common basic problems. For example, difficulties to access finance, a weakness of the extension services to reach farmers with proposals for adaptation. Not always there are enough proposals on how to adapt, because it's easy to agree that we need to adapt, but then when we speak about how do we adapt, this is an answer that is not simple, that there's not one size fit for all, so you have to pay attention to dimensions that are environmental, economical, and socially important. And finally, why a regional approach instead of 5 individual proposals to the Adaptation Fund? Well, because we think that regional projects are a very, very nice opportunity to optimize the use of resources, to enhance implementation, to share good practices, lessons learned, strengthen institutional partnerships, and facilitate the access of means of implementation for this project. But with the results of this project, to scale it up will be more easy, because countries will have something to show, concrete results, promising results, which will enhance the possibility to support the need for more means of implementation to scale up. So, and well, also to strengthen the governance, and to have more high-quality policies at national level that integrate NAPs, NDCs, and also the other sustainable development goals that all countries have. And I think that I have consumed my last 3 minutes. In the last slide, I thank you very much for your attention, and I show pictures of farmers, peasants, and communities in the 5 countries. The process is being involved. So thanks again, and if there is any question or comment, I'll be happy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Walter, for elaborating on the regional aspects. And also, it's really nice to see the link between the regional organization and the Adaptation Fund, so what's happening in the region, and also how capacity building is immersed within the region. So now we have, can we put the slide up? Yeah. Now we have another speaker from NAP Global Network. He will introduce a bit more, but it's a global network which is focusing on NAP supporting. So I think we can give a bit more example about how network is supporting NAP implementation and financing. So Mauritius, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Good evening if you're watching on YouTube. Thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation, the kind invitation to present our work of the NAPGN. It's getting a bit chilly here, so let's see if we can wake up a bit, if the AC hasn't done it already. My name is Mauricio Luna, and I'm Senior Policy Advisor for the NAP Global Network. And maybe to get us started, I think a lot of what I'm going to say is going to build on what Justice and Walter has just mentioned, with an emphasis on the NAP Global, on the National Adaptation Plan process. So to start, I would like to ask you if you can raise your hands, how many of you are familiar with the National Adaptation Plan instruments and processes? Most of the audience, which is great. So what I would like to share with you is a recent study on the national adaptation plans that had been submitted to the UNFCCC until February this year. As you know, as of now, we have around plus 60, I think we're counting 67 national adaptation plans that had been submitted to the UNFCCC, which is the primary instrument that countries use to implement their national adaptation priorities, including and ideally in alignment with the national adaptation plans. So, as you can see here, for this study, we analyzed 59 multi-sector NAP documents that had been sent to the UNFCCC. So the findings are based on this study, and you can access it through the code that you can see here on the slide. Also, it's important to highlight that here we capture some good practices and some challenges for NAP implementation, financing in particular, and we also discuss some recommendations on how to strengthen finance in the NAP process. So I'm going to move quickly to the next one. Excellent. So as you can see here, and this has been mentioned already by the previous speakers, some of the frequently cited finance obstacles that we came across in this study that was led by my colleague Maribel Hernandez is that there is low awareness on the existing funding opportunities, and also, as it was mentioned, the complex procedures that limit access to international funds. That we all know. Also, there is a difficulty in turning priorities into bankable projects, and this is a key element, which again limits the access to the funding. How do we go from the identified priorities in the NAP document to turn that into bankable ideas? Also, there is limited availability of suitable finance conditions for adaptation, which hinders the long-term investments in resilience. We know that this is a common challenge. How can we pool public and private and de-risk some of these investments is something that we really need to put our brains into. Also, the high debt and limited fiscal space constrains domestic resource mobilization, and this is true across the Global South, and for LDCs and some seats is even stronger. And finally, there is a weak local financing mechanism to reduce which reduces community ownership and sustainability. There are some countries that are making a great effort on coming up with their own climate mechanisms to channel climate funds to the local level, but I think we still need to learn more from each other on this. So, some of the key recommendations that you can find in this study are the following: to make the NAPs more investment-oriented. One is to clearly define and appraise the priorities for adaptation investment. It's not enough to identify the priorities, but to appraise those more broadly. Also, it's important to strengthen the cost estimates and funding needs according to the different priorities that have been identified in the NAP documents. It's also very important to map potential sources of funding and instruments. We had a presentation from Justice. If you're thinking about adaptation, there are dedicated funds, and there are dedicated windows in other funds as well. Also, it's important to establish finance tracking and monitoring systems to improve transparency and accountability. And clearly, from the funder or the donor perspective, this is something very relevant. And this is also contributing to our mail systems. Other general recommendations are to tailor adaptation finance strategies to national context, select the appropriate instruments based on the country's circumstances and capacity. We have not only differences between countries, but also within the countries as well that are important to keep in mind. Also, it's important to promote climate resilience fiscal planning in central finance agencies, and we have a couple of examples that you can go to in our report. Bangladesh has developed a climate fiscal framework, fiscal framework, and Azerbaijan includes some fiscal impact tools in their NAP, which is really important information for when countries are trying to identify what is the potential impact of adaptation in their fiscal space. Also, to diversify funding sources beyond the international public finance, encourage domestic resource mobilization and private sector engagement, and this can be done through de-risking investment using blended finance and guarantees, as it has already been mentioned. And finally, to reinforce governance, I think we can all agree on that one, coordination for adaptation, finance both horizontally across different sectors and vertically through different levels of government. So just briefly, we have identified some specific recommendations for least developed countries. And clearly they have a heavy reliance on external aid, which makes these countries more vulnerable to the shifts that we are unfortunately experiencing in donor priorities. Grants and flexible concessional laws are still very important for these countries to avoid increasing their debt burdens, as you know. And also, as you can see here on the slide, debt for climate swaps offer a dual solution for debt relief and adaptation finance. And finally, the last 2 points is that we really think that a phased approach is recommended, in which first you start building and strengthening institutional capacities, fiscal systems, and governance within these countries, which is one of the main obstacles that have been identified. And secondly, you gradually build capacity to mobilize domestic resources and to attract private investment. So last, these are probably the key messages, and this is the most important slide that we would like to share with you. Some final thoughts on what we learned from finance in the NAP documents. The first one, and we want to bring some clarity on these, national adaptation plan documents are not investment plans per se. They support dynamic, priority-based investment planning, for sure. They enable a better coordination and a better access to climate finance, and they help ensure effective targeted adaptation actions. So they are the first step to start thinking about investment planning. And as he was mentioning before, it's really important to keep in mind the iterative adaptation nature of planning, being through NDCs or NAPs, because priorities shift and the documents just reflect the country priorities at a particular time. But as it was mentioned by previous panelists, if an extreme event hits, then the priorities are going to change. If there is a drought, then the priorities in a specific sector are going to change as well. So it's important to keep in mind that these are iterative processes, and we have to use adaptive management to tackle those financial needs. So thank you very much. If you would like to learn more about our work, these are our emails, and yeah, happy to get any questions during the second half of this event.
Thank you very much, NAP Global Network, for a very informative description about NAP supporting. So now, as the PCCB Academy is an interactive and very active and dynamic session. So we are gonna have like an interactive Q&A. So probably as we don't have a lot of time, I will just invite the speakers here, and then you can ask questions if you have. And if you don't have any question, I will probably encourage or ask you to answer some of the guiding questions on the slide. I know that there are some country representatives are here, and also I also saw many hands who are very well aware about the NEP, so I will encourage you to ask any questions as possible. So it would be great if all the speakers come to the stage, and then we can start the Q&A. So first, if anyone has questions from the presenters' speeches and presentations, please raise your hand and you can ask whatever you have. Any questions? Okay. Yeah, please go ahead.
If you don't ask questions, we'll pass the mic around so that.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Rachel Ilam. I work for a program called Partnership for Agile Governance and Climate Engagement. Essentially, my question is to the Adaptation Fund. And it's great to see that some of the various funds are actually trying to align their processes so that it makes it a lot easier for countries to access. My question speaks to your first point around supply. So essentially, what stops the Adaptation Fund from being more proactive in terms of looking for supply instruments? So if we look at how we work, if we look at both sides and we work from demand and supply dichotomies, what stops the Adaptation Fund from being a bit more proactive in terms of engaging states, engaging countries to see what the possibilities and potentials are for bankable projects? Thank you.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks very much. Yeah, so as I said, that should have been an ideal world. Unfortunately, we are not in that utopian world. The process is designed that way to be a country-led process. And all the funds are limited in scope in terms of designing projects or going to the country and say, let's design this project and implement the project. It must come bottom up. But there are a few things that we do to close the supply side gap. And that is having South-South cooperation, where we organize forums and bring the countries that already have successfully accessed the fund to come and speak to the countries that are yet to, so that they learn from the lessons. When he was presenting in terms of the project he had developed in his last slide, he talks about the difficulty in terms of coordinating across different institutions, the long processes. These are the experiences when you share with countries that are yet to start the process. It's allowed them not to repeat some of the challenges or the mistakes they would have done. So that is one of the things that we are doing to close the gap. The other thing we are doing to close the gap is to use our readiness funding window to help countries to close institutional gap. So for example, if you nominate an institution to be accredited and the institution does not have a gender policy, if you see the presentation he did, he showed 15 ESP, environmental social principle, and your project must be in compliance with those principles. So when you are submitting a project to us, those are the criteria we use to review the project. So when you are going through the accreditation process, for example, your institution does not have environment social policy or gender policy, we'll give you technical grants to be able to develop that. So for gender, we'll give you $10,000. For environment social policy, we'll give you $25,000. You can hire a consultant to develop these policies. And this institutional building gets the country ready to be able to program not only with the fund, but with other international donor institutions that are looking for these high standards before they put money into your organization. And I'll give Bhutan as an example again. Until Bhutan went through the accreditation process, they were using cash accounting system. Now they've moved from cash accounting system and they are using accrual accounting system because of the capacity they have received, because they needed to improve upon their financial management system, because the expectation is that we do not want too much leakages or no leakage in the finance. Provide the money should go to the communities, it should go to the ground. But if you do not have this proper internal control system, then the money will find itself in wrong places. And also, we do not want our intervention to exacerbate existing vulnerabilities. And that is why you need to have gender compliance and environmental social compliance. So we all know that gender intersection impacts vulnerability. So we want to see that the project that you are implementing, you have the capacity and the institutional strength to be able to make sure that these intersectionality are really worked on well so that it did not even affect, access to adaptation fund resources. That we give money to you and there is a political settlement. Either you belong to this church or this religious group, or you're a woman or you're a man before you access the money. It shouldn't be so. There should be equity and access in terms of our resources. So we try to close these capacity gaps so that you get to that standard. Then you'll be able to program with us and be able to program with other institutions, both other multilaterals and bilateral donor agencies. So those are the way that we are trying to do close the supply gap. For other funds, they have technical support that they support the entities to make sure that the project get to a point where it could be funded, then they will put it to the board. The good news about the adaptation fund is that when you submit project to us, in 3 weeks, you get comments. I do not know his project. He said the concept notice is with us. I don't know the time they submitted it. If in 3 weeks you have not gotten comment, it means that you submitted it through what we call intermission. Intermission is where we are about a month to the board meeting. We stop every work preparing for the board. So if you submit a project around that time, it will surely go beyond 3 weeks before you hear from us. But once you submit it, not a month to a board meeting, and it's not intermission period, 3 weeks, you're gonna get your question. So if somebody also told you it's too long process to assess funding, their processes are difficult, I can tell you that over 60% of our project were approved in a single digit month. That means that less than 12 months. We are approved in less than 12 months, from concept, pre-concept to full proposal to the board for the board approval. Of course, there are 1 or 2 outliers where the project takes a long time to get approved, and I'll end here by giving an example. There was this country going through reaccreditation. Then they came back to me and said, "We have not heard from your fund 1 year." And I said, "Really?" I organized a call between them and the accreditation team. I asked them to open the workflow. They opened the workflow, and that week we were having the meeting was 1 year, 2 weeks. They sent them questions, and they've not responded to the questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think the time is up. Maybe we can get one more question, and if we don't no, okay. Mauricio and Walter, if you have like a last short sentence to wrap up, that would be great. Just very, very brief.
Very quickly. Thank you very much. Maybe something I will add quickly is that another way that we have identified that countries find useful is peer learning exchange. It's learning from each other. So we have, as one of the pillars of the NAPGN, we have peer learning, and we have run peer learning events where we bring countries together to learn from their experience, including how to access the different climate funds, different mechanisms, and different instruments. So in the interest of time, I will leave it there, and thank you.
Hello. Well, thank you very much. I think one of my last comments would be that bridging the NAPs and the NDC is a very important opportunity. So if a country has an NAP, then a country has identified its priorities, its needs, its opportunities, and then identify a roadmap for action and include in the NDC the adaptation components in coherence with the National Adaptation Plan. So, and then if you want, if you decide so, you can prepare your adaptation communication to the UNFCCC, everything in agreement, everything coherent and with synergies. It's not, NDC is not only mitigation, NDC can also include adaptation. But what is better to include adaptation than to have a solid national adaptation plan which guide your actions and your priorities and the use of our resources and the access to means of implementation. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much for all the speakers and participants for joining this session. I think time is up, so just please give applause to all the speakers again, and thank you for joining.